All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Resa Desai, Chief Sustainability and Strategy Officer at Sabert, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all today to today's webinar on Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR, in the US. Now, before we begin, just a few quick logistics for today's webinar. All participants will remain muted throughout the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function. Questions can also be posted anonymously, and we will do our best to address as many as possible live. Our goal is to make this session practical, useful, and responsive to the topics that matter most to you. With that, next slide, please. I want to take a moment to share who Sabert is and why this topic matters to us, right? Many of you on the call may already know this. Sabert was founded in 1983, and today we are a global food packaging company with more than 2,900 employees and 15 facilities worldwide. Our purpose is centered on reinventing food packaging to nourish and protect our world. And one of Sabert's strengths is our multi-substrate portfolio. We manufacture molded fiber pulp, resin, and make paperboard packaging that gives us the ability to help our customers, like yourself, evaluate packaging choices that are based on performance, cost, compliance, and sustainability, because as we all know, there is no one-size-fits-all answer in food service packaging. Another important part of our sustainability strategy is circularity, right? And through Novida, which is our recycling facility, we are advancing the use of post-consumer recycled content in our polypropylene packaging. Novida has FDA letter of non-objection for use in food-grade applications and also has EPR's PCR certification, which is required under California's EPR law. And our RPro blend, which uses 25% PCR from Novida in polypropylene packaging, also has EPR's recognition for recyclability. And that brings us to today's topic. EPR is quickly becoming one of the most important regulatory shifts impacting packaging, and it is also a very complex and fast-moving topic. And today's discussion is intended to provide both a broader understanding of the landscape and practical takeaways for what it means for our business. And to help us do that, we are very fortunate to be joined by two experts. First, we have Resa Dimino, who brings deep expertise in packaging policy, recycling systems, and EPR implementation. Resa is co-CEO of Resource Recycling Systems and managing partner at Signalfire Group, which is Resource Recycling Systems policy-focused subsidiary. And with more than 30 years of experience spanning policy, infrastructure, and end markets, Resa brings a practical perspective on how PCR policies translate into real-world decisions, from free structures to system design. We are also joined today by Carol Patterson from Food Service Packaging Institute. Carol brings an important industry perspective on food service packaging, policy developments, and also how companies can engage constructively as EPR programs continue to shape across the US. Carol is Vice President of Government Relations at FBI, and her work takes her across federal, state, provincial, and local policy conversations in both US and Canada. She's here on the webinar supporting the dialogue from a Q&A perspective. So thank you both for joining us today. We are excited to have your perspectives. And with that, I will turn it over to Resa to start our discussion.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in today. Always love to talk about recycling and recycling policy. So we're going to try to provide a little bit of clarity here as we navigate through the EPR landscape in the United States. So to do that, we're going to walk through a little bit of the basics of what is extended producer responsibility and what the current landscape looks like. We're going to talk specifically about covered materials and collected materials and how those are similar and different. We're also going to talk about fee setting and eco-modulation approaches, and then food service items and how they show up in EPR programs in particular. And then we'll give a quick outlook of what things are looking like for 2027. So first, let me do just a quick introduction of the Signalfire Group. We are, as mentioned, a subsidiary of Resource Recycling Systems. RRS is a mission-driven sustainability consulting firm focused on recycling systems and circularity. And about 5 years ago, we noticed with the significant uptick in policy activity related to recycling that there was a real need in the marketplace for a subsidiary, a consultancy that focuses specifically on policy and policy related issues. So we created Signalfire to particularly help folks navigate through the policy environment, understand what's happening and what it means for you all on a business level. So with that, we'll start in on the EPR basics. So what is extended producer responsibility? This is a policy and a practice that essentially requires producers to take responsibility for the management of the products and or the packaging that they put on the market at the end of its useful life. That responsibility can take the shape of a financial responsibility. It can be an operational responsibility. Often it's a combination of the two approaches. And when we talk about producers in extended producer responsibility, typically that refers to the brand owner, although sometimes it's the manufacturer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into food service later in the presentation. So at its core, EPR is a policy that provides sustainable funding for municipal recycling systems. So it's important to remember that the core of this is to provide that sustainable funding source. And so here we want to think a little bit about how the funds flow through that system. So in a typical recycling system, you'd see the municipality or the ratepayer at the center of the diagram. But here, in an EPR system, you see the producer responsibility organization at the center. And that organization is essentially created to allow a vehicle for producers to meet their obligations under the law. So producers pay fees into the producer responsibility organization, and the producer responsibility organization uses those resources to essentially fund and sometimes operate the recycling system. So they then enter into contracts or funding agreements with local governments, with service providers to make sure that the requirements of these laws, that there be free and convenient recycling, for example, are met. Sometimes those funds are used to support processing and end markets, and some of those resources go to the state agency to cover the costs of oversight. So looking at the landscape today, we have 7 states that have enacted EPR for packaging, and some have included paper products or printed paper. We have 3 states that are currently undertaking needs assessments, so looking at what it would entail to implement an EPR program. And then we have a number of other states that have debated or are currently debating EPR for packaging legislation in this legislative year. And this slide gives you just a very brief and high-level overview of the 7 programs that exist in the United States. I'm not going to go through this in super detail, but I did want to point out, while there are a lot of differences, particularly in the first 4 laws that have passed in terms of how they're structured, the EPR model, the financial structure, et cetera. What you'll see is the last 3 that were passed, Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington, there's a lot of commonality there. So we're starting to see some consistency emerge, particularly on things that are super important to your industry, which is like the definition of producer, who's responsible, and covered materials and things of that nature. In terms of program implementation, the first couple of states are well underway. Oregon launched its program last year. Colorado is launching its program this year. California will launch in 2027. Maine is on a slightly different trajectory, but we expect that that program will begin sometime this year, although it's running a little bit behind schedule. And then you see the three states that passed laws last year, Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington, coming into effect in 2029 and 2030. We did not demonstrate here the reporting deadlines, but do want to mention that all of the states where the Circular Action Alliance is the producer responsibility organization, so that's all of these states except Maine, have set a reporting deadline of May 31st. So if you haven't taken a look at the producer information provided by CAA, and you think you fall in that category, you should be doing that and thinking about getting your reports in. All right, so we'll do a quick overview here of what are covered materials and what are collected materials. So I mentioned before that that all of these existing laws, these 7 laws, include packaging as a covered material, but some also include paper products. And then some single out, they all actually single out food service ware at some level. Sometimes the food service ware is not explicitly called out, but the way the definition of packaging is defined, food service ware is included in these programs. And so what you see here is the overview of kind of what falls where. So essentially, food service packaging and food service ware is covered across the board. Want to mention packaging like products. These are things like cups or bowls or things that may be packaging or food service ware if they're used to serve a product. But it could be a product if you buy 50 cups or 50 bowls in the grocery store. So Oregon has included these materials in its program. Other states have not. I also want to mention that while we say California here covers only plastic food service ware, the definition of plastic in California is very broad and essentially includes any synthetic additive. So most paper food service ware that has any kind of coating would also qualify as a covered material in California because it would be considered plastic by California standards. So in each state, there's a determination made of what of the covered products, all those categories we just talked about, are designated for recycling collection lists. And each state has its own criteria for deciding what gets on those recycling collection lists. Most of them have some differentiation. They have a core list, which is the curbside collection list. In Colorado, it's the minimum recyclables list. In Oregon, it's a uniform statewide collection list. And then in addition to that, they have an alternative collection list. So in Colorado, that's the additional material list. That material may be collected in some curbside programs, but not all, or it may be collected at drop-off. In Oregon, the PRO acceptance list is of materials that are collected at drop-off, but not at curbside programs. So we picked a few examples here of food service packaging and where it falls on the lists in different states. Those lists are public, so it's fairly easy to access those. If it'd be helpful, we can pop links in the chat, and you can take a look at those category definitions and where your materials fall. But you can see they're not, the criteria aren't consistent from state to state. So just because something's on the list in one state doesn't mean it's on the list in all. So as we think about covered material and collection lists, it's important to understand the relationship between these different lists. So we're showing excluded and exempted materials here. Sometimes these are materials by category or by group. So for example, there are a number of states that include paper products, but not newsprint or newspapers. And so those would fall into that category, or sometimes it's a particular thing like blueberry packaging exempted in Maine, and things like that. So those are exempted and excluded materials. Those may show up in the recycling stream, but the producers of those materials are not obligated to pay into the system. Then we have the covered material list. So that includes those broad categories I showed earlier, packaging, food service ware, and in some cases, packaging like products and paper products. And essentially, anybody who is a producer of any of those covered materials pays into the system. And you pay into the system whether or not you are on that statewide collection list. So you can pay into the system and not have your material collected through the recycling program. Why do we do it that way? The policy reason is this: they don't want to provide an incentive essentially for producers to shift out of recyclable packaging into non-recyclable packaging by not having you pay into the system if you're not recycled. You also want to build that system if you're developing a material, if you're using a material that's not currently recycled. You want to build that system so that your material ultimately gets into the recycling stream. So for those two reasons, everybody who's on the covered material list pays into the system. And then you have the smaller universe of materials that are on the statewide collection list. So that's everything that's collected, a minimum list of what's collected at curbside in the state, and then the alternative collection list, which may be drop off or maybe some combination of drop off and other curbside material. Just also important to show here that the statewide collection list sometimes includes materials that are excluded and exempted. We refer to those as free riders, materials that are getting a ride in the system, but they're not paying the cost of that system. Okay. So getting through these kind of fast, but hoping to leave a lot of time for questions later in the conversation. I'm a fast talking New Yorker for those who don't know me yet. We'll talk a little bit about fee setting and eco-modulation. So on a very, very high level, very simplistic level, when we look at setting EPR fees, we look at how much does it cost to manage a material in the recycling stream? What revenue do we get for that material? And then that is used to calculate the base fee. So it's the cost to manage minus the revenue that comes into the system equals the base fee. Again, super, super high level, looking at how that is done. It's important also to remember that fee setting is about the price that producers pay to have their materials in the system and not necessarily about the cost directly of that material. So the first step in the fee setting process is that the producer responsibility organization, and in most cases CAA, needs to define all of the costs that need to be covered in the system. So what contracts do they have to enter into? Who do they need to reimburse? How are they going to fund? How much are they going to fund for education and outreach? What's it going to cost to administer the program? All of those program costs go into the overall cost estimate. And so we can refer to that as the cost of the pie. That's the cost of the entire pie. And then when you look at the fee setting by material type or by material category, you're looking at how does the PRO divide that pie by material category and then by producer based on what materials they use and how much. And therefore what the total financial obligation will be for each producer in the system. So as you have a system where there are materials that are paying in that don't have a direct cost, that price is going to reflect other factors that the PRO wants to consider in terms of setting those obligations. So just important to remember that distinction between price and cost. So there's a lot of discussion around eco-modulation and what does that mean? Eco-modulation is essentially an approach that allows or requires the producer responsibility organization to adjust fees to essentially reward the actions that improve environmental outcomes in the covered products. So reward positive environmental attributes and essentially penalize negative environmental or recycling related attributes. So every state in the United States has included, that's passed a law, has included eco-modulation factors. Those are all listed out here. So you can see there's quite a few of them. You can also see that there's a fair amount of commonality from one state to the next in terms of what eco-modulation factors need to be considered, but then there's a whole host of factors that may be used in only one or two states. So as CAA is developing its fee models for each of these states, they need to determine how to incorporate these different eco-modulation factors into the fee setting system. So how that price that we just talked about is going to reflect positively or negatively the impact of these different factors. Okay, shifting gears again, we're going to talk a little bit about food service items and the producers of food service in EPR programs. So one of the interesting things about food service is that the terms used vary from one state or one condition to another. So sometimes it's food service packaging, sometimes it's food service ware. So what we're noting here is where in states there's a specific definition of food service items, whether they're referred to as food service ware, food service packaging, or implicitly included in those definitions. And are those covered materials items limited to specific materials? Mentioned already in California, the limitation to plastics is the pretty broad definition of plastic, so there's not a lot that would not be covered in this scenario. And then the other important piece to be aware of is that both in California and Oregon, the producer of a food service item is defined specifically and therefore differently from the producer of other packaging. And so there are cases where folks that are not brands, are not typically producers, would be captured as producers in both California and Oregon. So really important to understand the details in those states, understand your supply chains in those states, and determine who in your supply chain is the appropriate producer. As I mentioned, there are some states that have distinct definition of food service. You have to look at the statute and the rulemaking that implements those statutes to get a really robust understanding of how those definitions are structured. Generally speaking, EPR policies look to try to obligate the producers at the highest level of influence. So the idea here is that the person who's making the decision about what that package looks like, what material that package is going to be, all of those things should be the one who's responsible for that fee, because they're determining the things that would impact that fee, both the material category, any recycled content that would have an eco-modulation bonus, for example. So that's what the definitions typically target. And they usually offer kind of a waterfall approach. So it says, first it's the brand, and then if that's not clear, then there's another step down and another step down. So sometimes you have to kind of follow the waterfall with your package to determine where you fall in or who the appropriate producer is. And that can be quite complex, but it's important to understand that kind of at the high level, they're trying to determine who's making the decision about what that package looks like and what material it's being made from. And that is typically who they're looking for in terms of the obligated producer. But the waterfalls can be, again, quite complex. You should engage your team and your professional expertise around how you fit into that waterfall. Also wanted to mention that language for the service packaging producers in Colorado, references specifically who directs or performs the manufacturing of a product. And that is a really important distinction. So again, mention that idea that they're really trying to get at who's making the decision about this material. Essentially, if you are buying off the shelf produced materials from a converter and you haven't done anything, you haven't ordered anything specific or anything like that, you would not be directing or directing the manufacturing of that item. But if that item is produced in a size, in a shape, from a material that only you as a company uses, then you would be considered directing the manufacturing. So here's a couple of examples. Contract manufacturing. As I mentioned, you might outsource the manufacturing, but you are specifying a particular type, size, etc. Then you, the person who's directing that contract manufacturing, are the brand owner and the obligated entity. If you're licensing in that instance, and you're not actually specifying that material design or content, the responsible entity would be the licensee. This concept is also included in Oregon, but it is below the level of producer definition. So the producer definition comes first, and then this is a secondary consideration in Oregon, whereas it's a primary consideration for service packaging or food service packaging in Colorado. All right, so we're going to take a quick look forward and then we'll open up for comments and questions. So what do we see on the horizon for 2027? Legislative session, 2026 session isn't over. We might still see action. Today there was action on the proposed EPR for packaging law in New York, for example. There's still a possibility there'll be some action this year. But if not, we're expecting the states in brown here to likely introduce legislation and move forward. And the needs assessment states, Hawaii, Illinois, and Rhode Island will all be finishing their needs assessments, or at least Illinois and Rhode Island will be finishing this year, and likely to tee up a legislative activity next year based on the results of that study. But any of you who do policy and legislation know that that is always a crapshoot of what's going to happen in the legislative session. So we're still looking at our crystal balls for next year. So just a quick advertisement here. If you or your colleagues need any support on the policy landscape, we at Signalfire are here to help. We provide legislative tracking services. We provide monthly newsletter and more regular updates on legislative activity and policy implementation in the EPR states, and also a host of custom services, policy landscape analyses, and things of that nature. We'd be happy to help you understand as we're navigating through this quickly changing landscape. And then I also wanted to do a quick introduction of my colleague, Carol Patterson. Those of you in the food service packaging industry are so fortunate to have such a terrific resource as Carol on your team and looking out for your industry as these policies develop. Carol and the Food Service Packaging Institute represent your industry in a variety of different contexts, and again, terrific resource for you all as we move through, again, this ever-changing landscape. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
All right, we have a few questions that have come in. Can you all hear me all right, or is there still an echo?
Sounds okay to me. I don't know about other folks.
All right. So the first question we have is, how are e-commerce sellers who are non-private brand importers of turnkey products held accountable for their packaging?
Okay. I think I got most of that description, but please correct or re-ask if I don't get it all. So when I mentioned that waterfall definition, e-commerce is addressed in that waterfall definition. So there, most of the producer definitions specifically say how the producer is defined in an e-commerce situation. Typically, the producer of the package for the particular product. So if you're buying a toy and bought you've bought that toy through Amazon, Amazon is the producer for the box on the outside, but the toy manufacturer is the producer, or the brand of toy is the producer for the package of the toy. Does that capture? And then the other piece may be a question around importing. And I think most of the states, again, in that waterfall definition, if there's not a producer within the state or within the US, then it's the entity that first imports that material that is typically responsible. Did I get all of that right, Carol? Carol's the expert here.
Well, thank you, Resa. You're far too kind. But on the e-commerce front, because food service packaging touches that just a little bit less than the traditional food service packaging that we represent, I would echo what you said in that there are very particular definitions and approaches to address e-commerce within each of the laws from my review of it as well. Thank you.
Oh no, can't hear you.
No, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So another question is, if you're not sure if you will need to be registering and do not take action, how does CAA or any pro for that matter in that state would know that you didn't, or you were responsible and you didn't register, and what are the consequences of that?
So the how will they know? I mean, they do checks of what's on the shelves and what's sold in the state and whether folks are registered. It is not CAA's obligation to enforce. It is the state's obligation to enforce. So typically, the state will identify the entities that should be registering, and then CAA will provide a list of who has registered, and the state will then take action to enforce against those who have not yet registered. That just happened, I think, a week ago in Oregon. So there's a list of companies that were just released in Oregon that the Oregon DEQ had identified that they believe are producers who have not yet registered in Oregon. What the ramifications of that are depend on the state, but most states typically will give you grace and say, hey, you're responsible for this, register right away, and kind of get in line. And then, the various enforcement actions happen after that. But the specific fines or other enforcement actions you would be subject to are going to depend on the laws of that state.
And I would only add to that that it is rumored, and I have heard it said in CAA webinars and communications that, you know, there's no advantage to not reporting early. You will be responsible for fees from when the program started. And, you know, depending on grace periods and all of those sorts of things, there could even be, you know, interest applied to those dollars if best efforts aren't put forward. But again, that is something happening through CAA just to ensure that there is, you know, no benefit to a producer that does not register on time.
Nope, we lost your sound again. No.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. But one question we have is, how are states determining where EPR fees apply? Is it the fee applied based on the ship to or end customer location or the distributor location?
It is typically, and again, the laws are state specific, but typically it is on the material that's sold or used in the state.
Okay. All right. We have one more question, and we may need a little bit of more information. But on the eco-modulation slide, if we can go back to that eco-modulation slide, is there a summary or maybe difference on what would create the biggest positive impact? If we are not able to hit all of those eco-modulation levers, can we at least achieve some of the biggest action items? So, in other words, is there a difference between eco-modulation fee incentive between these levers?
Well, that is a question for CAA, and I believe the only state in which the eco-modulation percentages are published is Colorado. Is that right, Carol? I don't know that Oregon has published them yet. So you'd have to look at the program plans and talk with CAA about what those percentages are, or what the bonus or malus fee elements are for those. They're going to vary by state, because certain states the law specifies, and certain states they have more flexibility. So
All right. The other one is, how are companies making sure that there is no double dipping, that they are also reporting, and their converters or distributors are reporting? How are they making sure that there is no double dipping?
I think coordination in the supply chain is important. And I think that the companies that are using some best practices in that manner that would make sense. There may be some of that CAA may be able to identify through the reporting, but I think it's really on the producer to make sure that their supply chain is appropriately engaged, both to avoid double dipping and also to ensure that everything that is potentially your responsibility in a state is being covered.
Okay, just going through the questions. Okay, why is there not a national EPR policy on recycling and composting?
We have not had national recycling policy in the 35 years I've been doing this work. I think our Congress has its challenges in implementing large, broad scale policy approaches, and so This is not something that has been high priority. Even other EPR programs. So, for example, there are 25 states that have EPR programs for electronics, and yet there's no national program. So I don't think there's really a lot of expectation or precedent on federal action. But, I'd love to be proven wrong.
Okay. All right. So this is going to be a little bit long. It's a specific example. So in states where the definition of food service where producers is a little different, so for example, Oregon and Colorado, they both have little different definitions. Can the obligated producer differ for the same package?
I think the answer is yes, but I'm going to invite Carol to chime in here.
Yeah, I would agree that the answer is yes, between states and even sometimes between usage within the state. It is very complex, which is why this question is clearly coming up. And I would say it can also differ if the secondary and tertiary packaging is obligated for something that's on a store shelf and in Colorado being sold unfilled. So, an unfilled product on the shelf might have one brand on it. The outer sleeve of that might be branded with a private label. The outer cardboard box might have no label at all. So you really do have to undertake a meticulous exercise layer by layer, which I understand is, as we said, very complex, but necessary because the answer to who is the producer might vary significantly between types of packaging and how that packaging is branded or not branded.
And as a follow-up to that, a similar question is, if you are a
I can't hear you. I'm sorry. I don't know, Resa, can you?
Very faintly.
Okay, leaning in.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So a similar question, probably a part B of the question that you just answered, Carol. If you are a co-manufacturer of a food product, is the co-manufacturer the producer or is the brand owner the producer?
I wish I could give you that answer because it will probably depend on a number of things. One, first, which state are you in? Secondly, the contract, the agreement between parties will have an impact on how that is designated as well. Resa, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the question, you'd have to look at the state. I think, are you directing the manufacturer? So are you designing that package? Who's responsible for making the packaging choice? I think is going to be a factor as well, at least in Colorado. So it's going to depend on the state that you're in and the nature of your co-manufacturing agreement, I would think.
So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit here. So again, going back to some of the eco-modulation questions we had, one more around that is, are there any advantages to adding PCR to, for example, a PT or a polypropylene product, given that they would still all fall under rigid plastics or in that category of fees? So if you can talk a little bit about, yes, the fees are there, but then they would get, some kind of reduction through eco-modulation.
Yeah, and use of post-consumer content, recycled content is actually the only eco-modulation factor that's consistent across all of the states. So using post-consumer material is going to provide you with a bonus on the fees for any of those materials. How big that bonus is probably going to differ from state to state, and you should be prepared to document the sources of that material and sort of get your supply chain ready for reporting on that material if you're planning to take advantage of that bonus. If the question is that going to offset the cost of an alternative material, I think it's going to depend on what the alternative material is and what other, kind of what the fee level is there. And the Oregon and Colorado fees are public, so you could look at those and make some calculations. They're done on a per pound basis, so you have to think about the cost per pound, how many units per pound you produce, and that sort of thing to kind of do. But that's a fairly simple math exercise that one could do looking at the alternatives.
Plus, it's also a lever for meeting the plastic source reduction under California, right?
In California, yes.
Yeah. All right. One question on reporting is that even though Minnesota and Washington do not come online until 2028 and 2029, and CAA has been asking, to provide the data in terms of simplified supply report, how do companies figure out what do they need to submit, and do they need to submit that information if they're truly not set up yet or not charging companies yet until 2+ years from now? Why are they asking for that information?
Well, in order to do proper planning and program planning, it's really helpful for CAA to have an understanding of what materials are entering this stream and what materials are going to be obligated, so they can start thinking about how to structure fees and how to break those things down and those kinds of things. But I can't really speak for CAA as to why they need that information now, or what the ramifications would be of not reporting at this point. I think it's helpful for them to have this information as they go into their planning. That's my guess of why they're asking for it, but I don't really know. I don't know if you have any insight, Carol, in any of the conversations you've had with CAA.
No, nothing extra to add there. You've covered what I know to date.
Awesome. Is there any industry exemptions being considered? For example, K through 12 or acute care, etc., exemptions by location.
By generator type?
Yeah.
We didn't cover that in this presentation, but every state has its own definition. They're usually called covered entities or something of that nature, and that's kind of who gets recycling service under the program. Many of them cover just residential, and then a few of them, I think, Oregon, California, cover commercial, maybe others. And if my colleague Isabel is on the line and wants to pop that information in the chat, that might be helpful. But yeah, the covered entities are included. And so in some states, those types of entities you mentioned, schools and institutions, are offered services through the system, and in some they are not. And that depends on the state and the law in that state.
Okay, so you mentioned the goal of this EPR law is to build infrastructure with the fees collected. So is there a set goal to build that infrastructure, or how is PRO going to be held accountable by the state that funds are being allocated and used properly? Or is it the state that is going to allocate the funds?
No, the PRO typically manages the budgets and allocates the funds, but that work is all laid out in the program plan. So first, there are a couple of actually, I think only California has goals and targets set in statute. So it says that we need to hit these recycling rates by these particular dates. So that's the target that CAA needs to meet. That's how the funding is going to be allocated to get the state to hit those targets. In other states, those specific performance targets are set through the program planning process. And also in California, CAA's plans are set through the program planning process. So one of the main things that a producer responsibility organization is responsible for is creating a program plan. The program plan lays out what the organization is going to do and how those activities that it does achieve the requirements of the law, and then what targets they're going to hit. So essentially, the program plan lays out what all those steps are, what investments are going to be made, what infrastructure is going to be supported, et cetera. That program plan goes through typically a public process, reviewed by the public, by the advisory group, et cetera, and needs to be signed off on by the state agency. And then once that's approved by the state agency, it's essentially a regulatory instrument. You said you're going to do this. You need to do this. If you haven't done this, then there are other actions that come into play, and that's the state would engage in enforcement at that level.
Yeah, I think Oregon might also have some targets around plastic recycling rates in statute. But yes, some
right.
in statute, some in program plans that come together the way Resa described very well.
And my colleague Isabel was not able to access the chat, but did remind me that in Colorado, some schools, institutions, and businesses will be brought into the program in future years, not in this first program year. You're silent again.
Is aluminum packaging part of EPR? And the answer is yes. It's part of EPR. Okay. Any thoughts or advice on how companies should think about California fees and eco-modulation, if there is in California, and then California plastic source reduction, and how do they work together or compete?
Those are some big questions. Every producer is required to do a source reduction plan. And so if you haven't started work on that, you should. I guess how to look at fees and eco-modulation, a little too early to tell because there's no fee schedule yet or eco-modulation plan laid out. So I guess I'm not sure how to answer that question. Carol, you have any ideas?
Similar that while we should have all the information to answer that question for you, with the regulations having just become final and effective last Friday, and the combination of guidance that is needed both from Circular Action Alliance, CAA, but also from Cal Recycle in order to fully prepare you. We're a bit short on the details as we sit here today, but yes, it will be unique to each company, and those individual source reduction plans, as we understand it, will be due sometime on or before August of this year. But of course, your source reduction sort of baseline data is due by June the 1st, based on the communications that we've seen so far come out.
Okay. Is there anything in the current EPR approved models that would allow for additional time to comply with performance targets? For example, chemical migration compliance is not met, or any requirements that are needed in the law. Is there time to comply?
Well, California is the only, well, I'm not sure about Oregon. Good point, Carol, that there are some targets for plastic set in Oregon. So I can't speak to that. But in California, there's a process called the Unique Challenges Exemption. And so if there is a package that cannot meet, or a covered material that cannot meet the recycling rate target, or cannot otherwise meet the requirements of the statute, they can apply, the producer can apply for a unique challenges exemption and make the case for why that package should be exempt. It's also or either exempt entirely from the requirements or be allowed more time to meet the standards. So CAA can also apply for unique challenge exemptions, and they will likely do that on a broader basis, on like a material category basis. If they say we're putting into place X plan to get this material to target, but based on everything we know, we will not get to the target, but we're going to do these things that are going to get us close. They can apply for that unique challenges exemption to get an extension on the timeline for those requirements. But if there's an issue with a particular package, it's the producer's responsibility to apply for that exemption for your package.
Got it. And I have one last question. We are coming up on time. So what's the biggest advice you would give to producers, as to future-proof themselves? So how do they set themselves up for success under this EPR landscape?
That is a really hard question because we don't know what the future holds. But there are, if you look at the lists of materials that are collected for recycling in the existing programs, I think there is a lot of commonality there. And I think if you have the opportunity to use a recyclable material as defined in those states, that is going to be an advantage. If you have the opportunity to use recycled content and meet some of these eco-modulation positive bonus criteria and avoid the malice criteria, all of those are good steps that you can take. Really looking at the design of your products and your packaging to make sure that you're designing for the recycling system and for that maximum environmental performance. Now, Carol, you got anything to throw in there?
Always terrible to go second. No,
sorry.
I'm just kidding. No, you made a lot of amazing points. I think so much of it is just, while we're thinking about future proofing, it's also so important to know current state and taking that inventory of your packaging portfolio today, looking at, primary, secondary, tertiary in terms of what your current portfolio looks like, to even start to identify where those challenges and opportunities are, as well as familiarizing yourself clearly with, obligations and where, so that current state and start to think about what you think the future should look like when it relates to EPR. As Resa chatted about, we certainly have seen an evolution of some of the laws, but we know there will be more variations in the years to come, and we're looking for all the smart people to help inform where this policy goes moving forward. So thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to take this opportunity again. Thank you so much, Resa and Carol. This was excellent. I learned so much from this webinar. Thank you for your time, and thanks everyone on the webinar. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Have a great day.